So today we will discuss the interaction of the emotional and cognitive systems during the decision-making process. But let's first to summarize the neuroeconomics view on the valuation process. So as you remember, decision-making process is divided by neuroeconomics in few stages. First, brain creates a representation of the problem. Next, brain evaluates different options. Next, we select an action and we evaluate the outcome of the action. And finally, we learn based on the outcomes of the actions. So valuation process, the valuation stage, perhaps is the most critical stage of the decision-making process. Because if we will use the principle of the utility maximization, we always select the option with the highest expected utility. So if we understand the valuation process, we would understand the key stage of the decision-making process. We actually would be able to predict decisions. So that's why most of the neuroeconomic studies are focusing on the valuation stage. Let's now summarize the current view of neuroeconomics on the valuation process. So we can measure the values very differently. For example, value can be measured objectively by the price. But let's say $10 CD can have very different subjective value for a student or for a billionaire, for a music fan or for a hockey fan. So real values are subjective. That's why economic theory suggests to use utility as a measure of subjective desirability of certain actions or decisions. So furthermore, economic theory suggested to use expected utility theory, because during the decision-making process, we not only estimate anticipated gains, but also estimate the anticipated probabilities of certain gains. So according to the expected utility theory, we integrate the probabilities of the outcome and the expected values of the outcome into expected utility. So furthermore, prospect theory suggested that not just values are subjective, but also our estimates of probabilities are subjective. That's why prospect theory suggests that we integrate both a certain nonlinear function of our values estimates with a probability weighting function. So both values and probabilities are subjective and nonlinear. And finally, neuroeconomics utility theory suggests that our values are encoded by neurons, and basically utility is an average firing rate of certain neuronal population located in certain specific brain structures. So according to the neuroeconomics view, our utility or neuroeconomic utility of certain option is simply an average firing rate of a neuronal population. So we do know some candidates for encoding utility in our brain. So for example, dopamine system perhaps is linked to this process. So what would happen in your brain when you will make a very simple decision? For example, you have an apple on your desk. So what would happen in your brain during this decision-making process when you would decide to eat this apple or not to eat this apple? So neuroeconomic theory suggests that your nucleus accumbens or ventral striatum will be activated. The activity in this region will encode the anticipated value, anticipated gain magnitude related to your decision. So we remember from various single-cell recording studies that when an animal touches a reward, dopamine neurons, including nucleus accumbens, are activated. These neurons are not activated when animal touches a non-rewarding object. So other neuroeconomic studies show that the function of the nucleus accumbens is more complicated. So here you see the results of the Pavlovian conditioning experiment. So at the beginning of the study, dopamine neurons react to the presentation of the reward. But at the latest stages of the Pavlovian conditioning procedure, dopamine neurons start to react to the cue predicting reward. So the situation is more complicated. Dopamine neurons encode not just the pleasure of the outcome related to outcome, but also the anticipated gain related to the cue predicting the outcome. So overall, dopamine neurons, including nucleus accumbens, they encode anticipated gain magnitude. We can measure it using fMRI technique also insides of the human brains. So here we once again see the results of the Brian Knudsen study. And this study nicely shows that when person during the fMRI study anticipates $0, 20 cents, $1, or $5, the nucleus accumbens is activated proportionally to the anticipated gain magnitude. So overall, the activity of the nucleus accumbens encodes the anticipated gain magnitude. So interestingly, other neuroeconomics studies show that some populations of the nucleus accumbens, some neuronal populations, encodes also probabilities of the outcome. So on this slide, we see that blue color indicates the neuronal populations in the ventral striatum encoding the probabilities of the outcome. So green color indicates the neuronal populations encoding the reward magnitude, and we see a heavily overlap of this. So it looks like overall ventral striatum is involved into the encoding of the expected utility. So we can summarize this idea in two important points. So ventral striatum or nucleus accumbens is active during the anticipation of the reward. And activity of the nucleus accumbens is proportional to the anticipated gain magnitude. It looks like different neuronal populations inside of the nucleus accumbens are processing the probabilities of outcomes, and other populations are sensitive to the reward magnitudes. So it looks like nucleus accumbens codes the expected utility. But what happens if we make a choice in a more real life situation in the store? If you do not just take an apple from your desk, but if you decide to buy this apple in the store. And Brian Knudsen nicely showed that during the online shopping inside of the fMRI scanner, activity of the nucleus accumbens predicted the purchasing decisions. As you see here, the activity of the nucleus accumbens was stronger in the trials when subjects purchased the product relative to the trials when subjects didn't purchase the product. So even in more real-life situations, nucleus accumbens encode our anticipated gain magnitude. So interestingly, nucleus accumbens is nicely located in the brain and has very critical connections to the key regions in the brain involved into the decision making. So nucleus accumbens or ventral striatum gets inputs from the prefrontal cortex. We will discuss the role of the prefrontal cortex today in more details. So it gets more cognitive high order information that is important for the decision making. It gets inputs from the hippocampus, from the memory system, from amygdala, from the region processing the costs, possible costs of our decisions. It has inputs from dopamine system, so it gets dopamine, that is most critical neuromediator for the valuation process. And nucleus accumbens interacts with other regions of the striatum involved into the motor programming. So overall, nucleus accumbens in a very nice strategical position in the brain to be a central computer processing and estimating values during the decision-making process. But what will happen if you will make a more complex choice between two different fruits? In this case, the role of the orbitofrontal cortex will be critical. As we know, orbitofrontal cortex is important for the integration of the multiple sources of information related to the decision-making. And it is involved into learning and so on, but in the situation when we select between two different objects or products, the role of the orbitofrontal cortex is vital. So here I present you once again the results of the single-cell recordings in the orbitofrontal cortex during the decision of monkeys to select between two different drinks presented in different quantities. So here the activity of the orbitofrontal cortex neuron is presented using this red color, and the actual decisions of the monkey are indicated by the black color, by black dots. So you see actually here that the activity of the orbitofrontal cortex neuron encodes the preferences of the monkey. So it is most active when the option presented to the monkey is most attractive. So actually neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex encode decision values. So activity of the neurons in the orbitofrontal cortex is critical for the selection between different options. So orbitofrontal cortex plays a critical role in the integration of the multiple sources of information. And it looks like orbitofrontal cortex can supervise nucleus accumbens. But what happens if you make a more complex decision, if your decision can be associated with potential costs? For example, you order in the restaurant a fugu fish. As you know, there is a very small but chance to die as a result of this dinner. So approximately 30-60 people every year are poisoned by the very strong poison tetrodotoxin that is contained in the internal organs of this fish. So what would happen if your decision is associated with potential costs? A nice study conducted in Hauke-Häkkinen laboratory, as I already told you, shows that the potential costs are processed in the amygdala and potential benefits are processed in the nucleus accumbens, in the ventral striatum. And it looks like the orbitofrontal cortex, the middle portion of the orbitofrontal cortex, actually compares the evidences for potential costs and for benefits, integrates them, and activity in this region is proportional to the difference in the activity of the amygdala and of the ventral striatum. So it looks like orbitofrontal cortex integrates the information about the potential costs of our decisions and potential benefits of our decisions. But what will happen if you already ate an apple and you learned that this apple, for example, is not so tasty? So it should affect your future decisions. And in this case, orbitofrontal cortex once again plays a critical, vital role. As we remember from Antonio Damasio's studies, patients with damages and lesions in the orbitofrontal cortex, in the medial portion of the orbitofrontal cortex, they actually show quite dramatic impaired behavior in the Iowa gambling task. So these subjects actually do not learn based on the negative outcomes of their decisions. So here you see the results of the study, and you see that normal subjects very quickly during the task switch to the optimal strategy. They start to select the advantageous decks. They start to gain more money. And in this task, patients with lesions in the orbitofrontal cortex, they stick to the disadvantageous desk. They do not learn from the negative outcomes. They lose money. So orbitofrontal cortex is critical for the learning process based on the outcomes of our decisions. But how would we integrate also the price into the decision-making process? So every day we go to the store and we not just think how tasty is the product, but we also take into account the price of the product. And as you remember, Hilke Plasman nicely showed in her study that price modulates the activity in the orbitofrontal cortex. So here, once again, you see the results of the fMRI study, and you see that the consumption of the wine tagged as a pricey wine dramatically increases the activity in the orbitofrontal cortex relative to the same wine that is presented as a cheap wine. So here, with two different wines, we see this effect. So the price can boost the activity in the orbitofrontal cortex, in the middle portion of the prefrontal cortex. And it looks like it is associated with a larger, higher pleasure of the consumption of the expensive wine. So simply the price can modulate the decision value signal in the orbitofrontal cortex. So overall, neuroeconomics studies show that our brain contains different networks related to different aspects of the valuation process. The nucleus accumbens, or ventral striatum, is encoding the anticipated gain magnitude. It is also involved into the risk-seeking behavior, but orbitofrontal cortex compares, integrates multiple information regarding the expected outcome of the decision. And it is also involved into the fast learning based on the, for example, negative outcomes of our decisions. So amygdala is a critical region to process and learn costs associated with our decisions. So we have to mention also insular cortex. This is a kind of emotional interface in our brain, indicating an emotional arousal associated with our decisions. And finally, we have to mention dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we will focus today on the activity of this region, and we will focus today on the interaction of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex with other brain regions involved into the valuation process.